Welcome to History Lunch Break from the Greensboro History Museum. My name is Glenn Perkins, and we're thrilled to be talking about O. Henry here today on what would be not good at math, but his birthday, his 118th birthday. Am I right? Did I get that right? You know, obviously September 11th is a day of remembrance for a lot of different things, but we also like to recognize it as the birthday of William Sidney Porter, really the best known literary figure to come out of our neck of the woods here in Greensboro, North Carolina. And here at the Greensboro History Museum, we talk about the early life and boyhood and education of William Sidney Porter. But you know, he departed our Piedmont, North Carolina pretty early on in 1882, made his way out to Texas. And so thanks to our great technology here and our ability to just bring in people from wherever they are, I'm thrilled to have Elyssa McCuistion here. She's a tour guide at the O. Henry Museum in Austin, Texas. Is coming to us from Texas. So hi, Elyssa. Thanks for being here and taking some time to join us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So it's, you know, like I said, we love to tell O. Henry's story, his boyhood, his time in working at his uncle's drugstore here in Greensboro, the time he spent at his aunt's school, Miss Lana Porter. We've got a little facsimile of that school right up here near my office in our Welcome to the Gate City exhibit. But like I said, Porter headed off to Texas at a pretty young age. So when did he get to Texas? And do you tell us a little bit about why he went there?
Well, so he left for Texas when he was 19 years old, and that would be 1882. There's actually a doctor here in Greensboro, James K. Hall, whose sons were running a ranch down in South Texas, the Dole Hall Ranch, which is in LaSalle County, about 90 miles south of San Antonio. And this was a time when a lot of people were moving out to Texas. After the Civil War, Texas was a state that hadn't suffered as much from a lot of the fighting and the turmoil. So a lot of people from the South went to Texas. And Will Porter was one of them. The main reason he went was he developed a cough that wouldn't go away. He was working in his uncle's pharmacy. The hours were long, the work was tedious, and the customers started complaining about this hacking cough that this scrawny young boy had developed. And the Porter family had a family history of tuberculosis. Will's mother probably died of consumption, which was the 19th century term for the illness. And Texas, especially San Antonio and South Texas, was supposed to be good for the lungs. So a lot of people went out there. So when Will got this invitation from the Halls, who were going out there on the newly constructed railroad, he went along with them, and he spent about 2.5 years on a sheep and cattle ranch down there. He did a little bit of sheep herding. He learned how to fire a six-shooter. He taught himself Spanish, which that part of Texas is where the kind of Spanish-Mexican ranching culture developed. But most of his time he spent sort of lounging around under a tree, reading whatever books he could get his hands on, including a dictionary, which he claimed to have memorized every word and definition. It was sort of his party trick. He would hand over the dictionary and say, I bet you a nickel you can't find a word in there I don't know how to define.
The salubrious times for our sickly Will. He goes and spends that time there, and like you said, not just absorbing sort of the healthy airs, I guess, of the Texas plains, but also learning some good stuff. So how does he make his way to Austin, and what does he do when he gets there?
Well, with most most things in his early life, he kind of followed the well, he was a rolling stone. He went with the flow. The Halls left the ranch and were on their way to move to Williamson County, north of Austin. And there happened to be another family. That's what Austin looked like about the time he got here.
Mhm.
So he got to Austin in 1884 and promptly started lodging with the Harrell family, who were also Greensboro expatriates. They had 4 sons, and a 5th one didn't make too much of a difference, so he stayed with them for a couple years. Austin was about 11,000 people back then. So compared to Greensboro and a cattle ranch in South Texas, sheep and cattle ranch in South Texas, it was a pretty bustling metropolis, especially since the railroad just came to town.
Um, so yeah, so tell me a little bit more sort of about what is Austin like in this time? You know, the railroad probably really helps transform it. You know, you got a university coming along. You know, what was life like when Will gets there?
Well, yeah, absolutely. The 80s and 90s were kind of the time when Austin was transitioning from being a kind of a sleepy frontier Old West town to being what they considered a modern city. The railroad was the main thing. While he was there, the population boomed from about 11,000 in the 1880s to about 18,000 in the 1890s. And the University of Texas opened the year before he got there. The new Capitol building was being built, and there was definitely a push to turn it into an attractive, well, the plan was to turn it into an industrial city by building a dam on the Colorado River, which never quite worked out.
Mhm.
They built the dam, but then it got washed away in a flood, and then they rebuilt it, and it got washed away in another flood. And Austin sort of stayed a residential town, which was heavily based around the university and the state government, the Capitol building, and also kind of the associations that sprang up around that. It was the economy was very dependent on cattle and cotton, like most of Texas in those days. But there was still kind of that old west frontier feeling hanging around the edges. There was a thriving red light district called Guytown, and Sixth Street was well, there were I think 43 saloons and about half as many churches. So it was a fun place for a young bachelor to run around in.
Yeah, a little different, I think, from our saloon to church ratio here in his native Greensboro. So I think he must have found that a very interesting place to be. Let me just say, if you've just joining us, this is History Lunch Break from the Greensboro History Museum. We're talking about um, Will Porter O. Henry and his life in Texas here with Elyssa McCuistion from the O. Henry Museum of Austin, Texas. So Elyssa, tell me a little bit about Porter's first wife, Athel. Did I pronounce her name right, first of all?
Well, it's actually Athel,
Athel.
yes, which is a Scottish name, which I don't know. It might have been a family name. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
Um, but oh yeah, that's him, uh, dressed in his finest sartorial splendor. Athol shared a lot of interests with Will. I mean, besides his writing and his interest in literature, he was an artist. Uh, he was a musician, and Athel was a very fine musician. She played the pianos. She sang soprano. I think in that picture she's dressed in a costume from a Gilbert and Sullivan. Excuse me, sorry, a Gilbert and Sullivan production. They both sang in the Austin Musical Union. Um, and they both their friends describe them as both having a quick wit and a love of literature, so they kind of bonded over that. Athel's parents, who owned a dry goods store, wanted her to marry a nice, respectable businessman, but she ended up eloping with Will Porter, which, depending on who you ask, may or may not have turned out well. It didn't end uh, happily for her, but or well, I'm sorry, we'll get to that in a minute, I guess. But
Yeah, I guess so. So, but tell me a little bit more about the romance and the elopement. Who was it that was it that they didn't that her parents didn't find young Will suitable?
that was part of it. There was also the concern that each of them had had a parent who died from consumption, and it was thought in those days to be hereditary. So they were highly discouraged from courting. Um, and they met apparently at a ball to celebrate the laying of the Capitol cornerstone. That was the main event happening in Austin, was the building of the new state capitol. And Athel was uh, today probably would she was the valedictorian of her high school class, Austin High School, and so she was selected to read a speech, and she placed some mementos from the school in the Capitol cornerstone, and Will saw her and was smitten. So they started courting on the sly, and one day Athel's mother sent her out to buy a spool of thread. She ran into Will Porter on the street corner, and he convinced her to go to the livery stable down the street, rent a hack and drive out to the Presbyterian minister's house on West 6th Street. And she came back the next day with a husband.
That's that's sometimes the price of running a hack is more than you might expect. So, um, and I think it's interesting to point out. I think you and I were talking yesterday when we were kind of chatting a little bit about sort of the artistic scene. You know that these images here from the Gilbert and Sullivan, represent. Both of them sort of engaged in this lively community that's happening in Austin. What else? What were some of the other activities that Will was involved in? And he's obviously going to get to start writing too, or publishing, I guess, in Austin as well.
Well, he was he briefly worked in a pharmacy here in Austin, but seems to have quit when it got in the way of having a good time. But he joined a singing quartet called the Hill City Quartet, which performed at church functions and social gatherings. And then another sort of more raucous group, the Jolly Serenaders, who went around and, the Jolly Entertainers, who went around serenading the young ladies and the people of Austin generally. But he also he illustrated a book in Austin. He was a draftsman at the General Land Office. He got that job again through Richard Hall, who he knew back in Greensboro, which easier to get a government job if there's some nepotism involved. But his main literary activity in Austin was publishing a newspaper called the Rolling Stone. That was kind of his first attempt to make a living as a writer. So that page is sort of a special feature that the Rolling Stone sometimes had, which was a parody of incompetent small town newspapers, which had deliberate typographical errors, misprints, hyperbolic jokes about what was going on in town. And maybe he based that on some of the small towns he'd been to. And that's what the front page of the Rolling Stone generally looked like. It had cartoons mainly drawn by him, stories mainly written by him. It wasn't totally a one-man operation, but Will Porter was definitely the driving force. Of course, when he started publishing the Rolling Stone, he was supposed to be focusing on his bank-telling job. So that may have been part of the reason why that didn't end well. But not just the Rolling Stone, he was also publishing little bits and pieces, humorous asides, jokes, one-liners, sending them off to other publications like the Detroit Free Press, The Truth, some newspapers in Washington. So he was getting a couple dollars here and there for the amusing little bits he was writing. And that was, I think that's sort of the unifying thread of his time in Austin. Like everything he did, he was an entertainer. He sang, he drew, he performed, he wrote. He wanted, well, I don't know if he wanted people to like him necessarily, but he wanted people to be entertained by him. And some people were. Some people were less amused, but eventually he was able to parlay that into a career.
I think it's interesting because, I think some of what we talk about here at our museum is, and what we're lucky to have in our collections are some of his early sketches that he made while working at his uncle's drugstore here on South Elm Street in Greensboro. So there's great images of traveling salesmen coming through the drugstore. And then there's also a very famous picture of Albion Tourget, who, as a carpetbagger, so in the moment of Reconstruction here in, Greensboro, after the Civil War, Tourget was not a fan of some of the more traditional conservative-minded residents of Greensboro. Others supported him a lot, but I think Will Porter kind of followed, the view of him as this flighty man from the North who's coming down to sort of fix the South. So I think it's interesting, that sort of his drawings and his his creations are coming up from these places, where he's spending his time, and he's really, has his ear to the ground, I guess, in a lot of ways, and picking up some of the conventions from society from where he is. So, he's got all these jobs, but I guess, well, you mentioned that he goes to work at the bank, which is that's where the story is going to get interesting, right?
Hmm. Yes, well, yeah, there he is behind the teller's cage, maybe foreshadowing there. But the First National Bank in Austin, as with a lot of Texas banks, which there's a story that O. Henry later wrote called Friends in San Rosario, which sort of goes into well, I guess this sort of ties into what you're talking about with the conservative Southern culture, that a lot of these institutions were run on a handshake, gentleman's
Mm-hmm.
agreement. If you were the right kind of person, if you had the right connections, you could get away with a lot. And the First National Bank, where Will worked, was very much um, run by wealthy cattlemen for wealthy cattlemen. And their bookkeeping was not up to the standards of the federal government. People kind of borrowed money when they felt like it, paid it back when they felt like it. Um, and yeah, both customers and employees got into the mindset that it was okay to borrow some money and not keep the record straight as long as you eventually paid it back. The problem was the bank was sold to a new owner, which this gets really complicated, so I won't go into it too much unless people want to know the specifics. But
Mm-hmm.
there was an audit of the First National Bank, and about $5,000 turned up missing. So Will Porter was not only a teller, he was also the bookkeeper, which he did have a little bit of bookkeeping experience before he started working there. But he basically had taken the bank job because he lost his job at the land office for political reasons. Hall quit to run for governor. The new land commissioner put his own friends in the roles, and so Porter, by that time, Athel and sorry, by that time Athel had given birth to Margaret, their daughter, so he had
Mm-hmm.
a wife and daughter to support. So he took the first job available, which was not one that he was very well suited for. And the bank had problems before he started working there. The previous teller had been accused of embezzlement. The president of the bank, George W. Brackenridge, got robbed of $1,000 in gold on a stagecoach trip. Um, there had been deposits going missing. So he came into a system that was already kind of iffy and promptly proceeded to make it worse. That might be unfair.
Right.
But that's kind of that's kind of the impression I get just comparing the various accounts of what happened.
And the case sort of drags out some, right, between the accusations, the actual charges, and well, and obviously his sentencing. He goes to Houston, right?
Yes. So he resigned from the bank in 1894, and there was some delay before he was formally charged. At first, his father-in-law, Athel's stepfather, paid back some of the missing money, and they thought that would take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the bank examiner was was really determined to root out some of this long-standing corruption in the Texas banking system. So Porter left the bank, worked on the Rolling Stone for a little while. It didn't really make him any money. It folded after about a year. So he got a job as a columnist on the Houston Post. So he was in Houston when he got the news that he'd been formally charged with embezzlement. By that time, Athel and Margaret had gone back to Austin, where we're staying with Athel's parents. And Will was supposed to go back to Austin and face the charges. He borrowed about $250 from the editor of the Houston Post for legal and traveling expenses.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of showing up for in Austin, he somehow managed to wind up in New Orleans and eventually in Honduras.
So he goes on the lam. Are there a lot of good sources about his time in Honduras and sort of what he does there, while he's avoiding facing those charges?
There's not a lot of reliable sources. There's one book that was written by a prison friend of Will Porter's, Al Jennings, who was a liar turned bank robber turned actor, who wrote a memoir called Through the Shadows with O. Henry, which he claims to have been with Porter in Honduras, but his account of their adventures is whimsical and a bit far-fetched. Porter himself didn't really talk about that time, although he did. There's a collection of stories that he published called Cabbages and Kings that uses that material sort of based on he spent his time in Trujillo, Honduras, and he used some of the characters and material that he gathered there for his stories, but it's not really straightforwardly autobiographical. There are a lot of Americans on the lam in his stories, but as far as what exactly he did, there's sort of bits and pieces. He wrote a couple letters back home, but there's not a lot to go on. We do know that I forgot to mention this earlier, but he came back to Austin because Athel was dying of tuberculosis. She had already been ill when he left. And apparently his plan was for her and Margaret to come join him down there, and they were going to start a new life in Honduras, which it's hard to see that as the action of an innocent man, but by his account, he panicked, wasn't sure what to do. But Athel was too ill to travel, and he got a letter from his mother-in-law saying basically, if you want to see her again, you need to come back now. So he came back to Austin to be with her, and was able to stay with her while she passed away. And then a few months after that, he went to trial.
And do we have is the trial account, I guess that is something that we still have a record of, and his biographers are, kind of cover thoroughly?
So there's a lot of original court documents, the various, which I'm really bad with legal terminology, but the various indictments and charges, and we have those documents exist, and also some documents from an appeal he later made from prison, but the actual court transcripts have gone missing, so we don't know exactly what evidence was presented at his trial, exactly what those who testified said. He didn't testify in his own defense. He basically sat there and stared at the ceiling throughout his trial, and he made no, later one of his lawyers said he was the most uncooperative client they'd ever had. He wouldn't go through the documents, he wouldn't try to come up with a defense. He basically sort of sat back and let things take their course. And I think part of that was his grief over Athel's death. Part of it was maybe he knew there was nothing he could say that would clear him after he fled to Honduras. And it's interesting that it's sort of that period between her death and his trial that he really started to get short stories published in national magazines. So he did, I mean, he did publish a few little things here and there, but his first story with a twist ending, essentially, The Miracle at Lava Canyon, was accepted for publication in 1897. Didn't come out until he was already in the penitentiary, but that's when he sort of broke with his life of a dilettante in Austin and really sat down and became a serious professional writer.
So it's really, I mean, it's coming out of this both personal tragedy and the, you know, and also his time, his incarceration, that he's going to take all this stories and experience that he's kind of pulled together through these different things and start turning it into something that he's going to be able to really make a living at. And is after he, how long does he serve, and is when he gets out, does that sort of really mark the end of his time in Texas?
So he actually served his sentence in the Ohio State
Mm-hmm.
Penitentiary in Columbus, Ohio. So that was because it was he was convicted under federal banking laws. So he served time in a prison that was housing federal criminals. So he left Texas in 1898 and never came back. His daughter and his in-laws moved to Pittsburgh, so he never had a reason to return, and he was very reticent in talking about his past. He occasionally mentioned that he lived in Texas, and of course, about 40 of his stories are set in Texas, either on a ranch or in some version of Austin, some in the Texas Hill Country. So, but once he got to New York, he tried to keep people from finding out about his life in Austin.
So yeah, so he's kind of leaving behind that part of his past, and yet here you guys are in Austin, Texas, home to the O. Henry Museum. So tell us a little bit about that. You know, what is on the site, what you know interpret there at the museum in Austin.
Yeah, there it is. So the museum itself is a late 1880s cottage. The Porter family rented it from about 1893 to 1895. So they didn't live there a very long time, but that was during the time he was publishing the Rolling Stone and the time he was working at the bank. So the house itself was donated in the late 1920s, and moved to a park in downtown Austin. And it's been a museum since 1934. It's a house museum. There's some furniture and some belongings of the Porters, some furniture and artifacts that belong to the family. Because in the 30s, that was only about 40 years after the Porters had lived there. So there was still a lot of people around town who had known them, who had a connection to them, and especially a lot of Athel's friends. She was very well liked in town, and a lot of her friends had gone on to become the members of the civic organizations and women's groups that were instrumental in starting museums and saving historical artifacts around that time. But so we have it basically set up kind of like, kind of like a 1890s home in Austin would be, although now we have air conditioning, which is great. And electricity, I hasten to add. But right now, actually, the museum is going through a restoration. We're doing a lot of things. We're putting in a fire suppression system, which is great for a wooden house.
Yes, it is.
They're improving the heating and HVAC system, so it'll be more energy efficient. I believe they're putting on a new roof, putting in some better lighting, and so it'll be more climate controlled and hopefully will last for another 100 years or so.
Well, that's wonderful. You know, and I'm hoping I can get there someday and see it. When does the museum expect to reopen?
Sometime early in 2021. We're I believe Oh dear, I should know this. I believe we're shooting for March or April, but I'm not certain. We do have a website if you're curious, which will have updates on that. Um, it's ohenrymuseum.org, and you can also uh, see that there's an online tour you can take. So if you can't get down here, obviously we're closed, but you can go through and see the rooms, each room, how it's laid out. And we also have an online collections database. So we have all of our archives that we can't display, letters, photographs, closer looks at the furniture and artifacts. So you can get there from that website as well.
That's great. And you are, again, operated by the city of Austin. So just like us here in Greensboro, you're a municipal museum, kind of supported by your city, by your community. We got some compliments to you here in the chat, and a lot of folks sort of noting the a little bit about skeptical about some of Al Jennings' sources, but of course, with O. Henry, I guess all things, you never know quite 100% what's fact and what's fiction sometimes. But I want to know, so if folks have more questions, I'll pass them along to you. But I wanted to ask a little bit, sort of how does Texas, or how does Austin in particular, remember O. Henry? Are there activities or societies or festivals or anything along those lines?
Well, the big one, which has been an annual event for, well, this would have been the 43rd year. It's been pushed back a little bit, but it's the O. Henry Pun Off, which is the World Pun Championships, named for O. Henry and his love of wordplay and wit. So that's a big event. There's also an O. Henry Middle School in Austin. And my favorite kind of ironic twist is that the federal courthouse where he was convicted of embezzlement is now named O. Henry Hall in his honor. So I wonder if he'd be amused or horrified by that. Hopefully a little bit of both. But oh yeah, and if you want to find out more about the Pun Off, you can go to www.punoff.com.
Fantastic, and one of our watchers has popped that into the chat, so I'm definitely going to go take a look at that. Yeah, here in Greensboro, we've traditionally had sort of a series of theatricals, the 5 by O. Henry stories that have been put on here at the museum for, oh gosh, nearly 3 decades. Again, this year, not something that's been able to happen. But a little less. Somebody was asking. There used to be a William Sidney Porter elementary school that somebody had mentioned in the chat that I will have to look up to see exactly what happened to that school, or if it got renamed or changed around. I think most famously we had the O. Henry Hotel, which was in downtown Greensboro, and sort of as recently, well, not recently, I guess, around 2000. Was resurrected in a different part of town, but is still a very active part of our city. So, it's again, O. Henry Boulevard, but man, if we only had a Pun Off or something similar to that, would be really fun to add to that as well. Let me just ask you sort of what, to wrap it up, sort of what do you think is most important to remember about O. Henry nowadays? Sort of what do you like to most convey about him and his work to the visitors you get from around the world there in Austin?
I think the most important thing is just the power of a good story. He wrote his stories for, he claimed, purely commercial purposes, but it's amazing how many visitors we get from around the world. We get a lot of visitors from Russia, from India, from China, and his stories, I would have thought, were very, very specific to early 19th century America. Why did I say 19th century? Early 20th century. Sorry. but they have a lot, this thicket of references and allusions and puns and just sort of current events that wouldn't translate. But the stories of his that are most popular, like The Last Leaf, The Gift of the Magi, The Ransom of Red Chief, I think they appeal to people from all over the place. And part of the value of his work, I think, is it offers such a specific and well-observed window into a formative period of American history. And he wasn't just a regional writer. He didn't just write about the South. He didn't just write about Texas. He didn't just write about New York. He gives you a little bit of a glimpse into each of those places, sort of from the perspective of an outsider who doesn't quite belong to any of them. And I think it's a really interesting historical document. Of course, some of his stories don't translate as well into the modern age, but enough of them do that I think he will continue being read.
Well, I think that's a tremendous synopsis, sort of, I think, of his value and his continuing hold over the imagination, and it's like you said, it's not just the imagination of the South or the imagination of the American imagination, but really something that has gone on to draw in a readership from all around the world. I would really like to thank you, Elyssa, for spending some time with us and sharing, your great knowledge of O. Henry. Thanks again for everybody tuning in to today's history lunch break. We're going to be back next Friday talking about National Dance Day here in Greensboro and some of the dance traditions that our immigrant neighbors here or traditional ones to our area. There's typically a big festival in LeBauer Park right next to the Greensboro History Museum. This year it's going virtual online, so we'll have some of the dancers and some of the organizers talking about those traditions and how dance really helps make our community. Again, this show comes to you most Fridays. We've got a great archive of shows available on the Greensboro History Museum YouTube channel, so check those out. We're always looking for interesting ideas, topics, and speakers, so anybody who has any suggestions, pop us a note and we will take a look. So thank you again, Elyssa. It's been really great spending a little bit of time with you. It's been, wonderful to make a virtual visit down to Texas and to be able to learn more about the museum there. So thanks very much.
Thank you.